And now finally coming to the projection fibers, guys. The projection fibers again can be of several type. Now projection fibers, the example for the projection fiber could be the internal capsule. That is a main example. We'll be talking in detail about this internal capsule. Fornix is an example of the projection fiber. Fimbriae is an example of projection fibers. And especially this internal capsule and fornix is important. And especially internal capsule. Now, internal capsule, when I say internal capsule is a projection fiber, I should also say that corona radiata is also projection fiber. I have to say this because it's the internal capsule only which will become corona radiata, or you can say corona radiata will converge as internal capsule. What I'm trying to say, if this is the internal capsule here, let's say that this white matter bundle is internal capsule, and then the same white matter bundle which is more compact will be seen radiating into the cerebral hemisphere, and we call it corona radiata. So internal capsule will become corona radiata. The question is at what level, at what point you start calling the internal capsule as corona radiata, and that is the level of corpus callosum. Just for the reference here, guys, if this is the corpus callosum, so what you will see at the level of the corpus callosum, we will start calling the internal capsule as corona radiata. Then you will see once the fiber reaches the upper border of corpus callosum, you will see them radiating into the different part of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay. Now we already saw the relations of internal capsule in the previous diagram. So let me write more about the internal capsule here. We got 5 parts of internal capsule, namely anterior genu, anterior limb and genu, anterior limb, number 2 genu, number 3 is the posterior limb, number 4 we have retrolentiform part, and then we have a portion called as sublentiform part. Retrolentiform part and sublentiform part. Now these are the parts of the internal capsule. How to locate these parts? Now once again, if I just sketch the internal capsule part for you, this clearly is the anterior limb, then we have the bend, that is a genu, we have a posterior limb, and these relations are based on this lentiform nucleus. I'm not drawing that thing once again, but as you already know, lateral to the internal capsule, this is lentiform nucleus. This here, let me just write this one only, that is the lentiform nucleus. So what do you see if I just draw this dotted line here, guys? This is the anterior limb of internal capsule, which is between what? Lentiform nucleus and caudate nucleus will be on this side. The bend here, this is the genu part of the internal capsule. This here is posterior limb till the level of lentiform nucleus. We call it posterior limb till the level of lentiform nucleus because the portion that we see extending beyond the limit of lentiform nucleus is the retrolentiform part. This one, RL, I'm writing for the retrolentiform part. So when you take the transverse section, you can see anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, and retrolentiform part. The only part which we cannot appreciate well in the transverse section is the sublentiform part. As the name suggests, it is below. It is sublentiform part. So just for the sake of completion, let us say this is the sublentiform part here. Although it will be below, but I'm just going to draw it like this. That is the portion which is below, that is sublentiform part. So these are the 5 parts: anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, retrolentiform, and sublentiform part. They are named based on the relation to the lentiform nucleus. Knowing the parts of internal capsule, now what is important is to know that what tracts are passing through this internal capsule. Right? Internal capsule is the passage for all the ascending and descending tracts to the cerebral hemisphere. And we know that majority of the ascending tracts or majority of the sensory tract, they will either go through the thalamus or through the metathalamus, that is lateral geniculate body or medial geniculate body. Therefore, ascending tracts which you will see in the internal capsule, they will be named as thalamic radiations. Anterior thalamic radiation, posterior thalamic radiation, and then we have optic radiations, and all these auditory radiation. These are thalamic radiations. And when you talk about descending tracts, the main descending tract will be the corticonuclear, corticospinal, and some extrapyramidal tract also. Why it is so important to know about these tracts in the internal capsule? Because if imagine, just take one example. If genu, this small part genu over there, is giving passage to the corticonuclear tract. When you say the word corticonuclear, that means it should be the upper motor neuron for the cranial nerves. Corticonuclear, right? Or to the corticopontine, or you can say to the corticospinal tract. So a very small lesion in the internal capsule will have a widespread effect, because all the fibers are kind of condensed or compressed in this small part here. So that's why the internal capsule lesion, even a small lesion in the internal capsule, will have a widespread effect on the body. And that's why the blood supply of internal capsule, location of the tract in the internal capsule, lesion of the internal capsule becomes so important clinically as well. So first, let's justify that what are the tracts that you are supposed to see in the internal capsule. So guys, when you talk about the tracts in internal capsule, obviously there will be some ascending and some descending tracts. There will be some ascending tracts that we will appreciate there, and will be some descending tracts also. Let me deal with them one by one. So first, the ascending tract. Now roughly, let us say if this is a thalamus here, and when I'm saying thalamus, I'm including median lateral geniculate body as metathalamus here. Let us say this is a geniculate body is also there. Just imagine if that's a medial geniculate body and that is a lateral geniculate body. So basically you're looking at the thalamus and the metathalamus simultaneously. Thalamus, medial and lateral geniculate body. So from this thalamus or from these geniculate bodies, those radiations, the one which we were talking about in the tracts in the spinal cord, will be coming out. So we have like the radiations called as the superior thalamic radiations. These are the superior thalamic radiations. Then we have anterior thalamic radiations. We'll talk more about these thalamic radiations in the connections of the thalamus also separately. So these are the anterior thalamic radiations. And that is why I'm not talking about the nuclei of the thalamus right now. And then from lateral and medial geniculate body, guys, there was the posterior thalamic radiation or optic radiation. Remember? Optic radiation is also called as posterior thalamic radiation. And the one coming from the medial geniculate body going to the temporal lobe, that is the auditory radiation or inferior thalamic radiations. Inferior thalamic radiations. So when you will talk about the ascending fibers or the sensory fibers in the internal capsule, you have to consider these four radiations: anterior thalamic radiation, a group of superior thalamic radiation, we have optic radiation or posterior thalamic, and we have inferior thalamic radiation or auditory radiations. So before we talk about the descending tract, let us first mark these ascending tract where they are present in the internal capsule. Now, knowing the shape and the part of the internal capsule, it won't be difficult for us to mark and even to understand that. See, there we go. Anterior limb, genu, posterior limb, retrolentiform part, and then we have this sublentiform part. I'm not even writing that. Let's do one thing. Let's use some particular color for one type of the fibers. Anterior limb. Anterior limb, I'm using a color for the anterior limb here. It is giving passage to the anterior thalamic radiations. Make sense? Anterior limb will give passage to anterior thalamic radiations. Superior thalamic radiation, widespread, which is in the genu as well as in the posterior limb. That is the superior thalamic radiation. Mark that, please. It's in the genu as well as in the posterior limb. We have the superior thalamic radiations. And the two which are quite obvious, just think about it, guys. We said posterior thalamic radiation is optic radiation. Posterior, the word is posterior, and the most posterior part is retrolentiform part. Inferior thalamic radiation or auditory radiation, they have to go down into the temporal lobe. So obviously they will go from where? From the sublentiform part, the one which is below. So in the retrolentiform part, you will appreciate the posterior thalamic radiation, which as I said are also called as optic radiations, or the optic radiations, which are coming from where? They are coming from the lateral geniculate body. We'll talk more about that also in the visual pathway. And then finally, we got this sublentiform part, which is below. So obviously it is giving passage to the inferior thalamic radiation. It is giving passage to the inferior thalamic radiation, also called as what? Auditory radiation. That is also called as the auditory radiation here. Makes sense again? Coming from the medial geniculate body, going into the auditory cortex, so they have to go downward. How they will go downward? By using the lower part of the internal capsule. What is lower part of internal capsule? Sublentiform part. So this is about the ascending tracts or ascending fibers, what part of the internal capsule they will be occupying. Now coming to the one which is more important, that is the descending tract. The descending tract are located in what part of the internal capsule? So I've written the descending tract there. So let me just write it here about it. Now see, descending tract which is going through the internal capsule, you will see that the descending tract are of mainly two types. We have fibers which are called as the corticopontine fibers. We have corticopontine fibers. We got corticospinal tract. There is a corticospinal fiber or corticospinal tract. And we have some extrapyramidal tract also. If I may write the third category here, that is the extrapyramidal tract. What is extrapyramidal tract? The one which are going to the substantia nigra, to the red nucleus, all those the corticostriatal fiber or the corticorubral fibers, no, all those are called as extrapyramidal tract. And we also have a category, apart from corticospinal, we got a corticonuclear tract also, which is mainly for the nuclei inside the pons, or you can say for the cranial nerve nuclei. Cranial nerve nuclei, whether it is third nerve in the midbrain nucleus or for the facial nerve in the pons, or let's say for the hypoglossal in the medulla. So these are basically the upper motor neuron for the cranial nerves. So corticopontine fibers will be seen, corticospinal tract will be seen, corticonuclear will be seen, and then apart from that we have some extrapyramidal tract also to be seen in the internal capsule. Let us take care of the corticopontine fiber. Now the word corticopontine is quite vague, because when you say corticopontine, then we are actually talking about the corticopontine fiber coming from the 4 different lobes of the cortex. The one which will be coming from the frontal lobe, we call them frontopontine fiber. Then we have paritopontine, temporopontine, and occipitopontine. So please also note that when you say the this corticopontine fiber, they are of 4 types. We have these frontopontine fibers, which are the most extensive one, frontopontine. We got paritopontine fibers. We got occipitopontine fibers, and I'm purposefully writing at the last, that is temporopontine. Temporopontine fiber, just to make it easy for me to mark them in the diagram. So frontopontine, paritopontine, occipitopontine, and temporopontine, coming from the 4 different lobes of the cerebrum, coming to the pontine nucleus, and then they will decussate and go toward the opposite cerebellar cortex. That is the cortico-pontocerebellar tract. Remember that tract, cortico-pontocerebellar tract. It comes to the ipsilateral pontine nuclei and then it will decussate and goes to the opposite side cerebellar cortex. Okay. Let us try to put all these fibers in the section of the internal capsule. This is one very, very important section, and again, you will be able to solve certain questions based on this. So, please remember these frontopontine and all these fibers here. So, let me just try to draw it on the side. Okay. So, there we go. This is the internal capsule once again. Again, the genu part, the posterior limb, the retrolentiform, and the sublentiform part. We don't have to label anything. Okay. Now, if I again use some color code here, so that will help me out here, like frontopontine. Let me use the yellow color. You can just shade it with a common color or something. Frontopontine fiber are the most extensive fiber when you see it in the internal capsule. So the frontopontine fibers will be going through the anterior limb, from the genu, as well as from the posterior limb. Look at that. It's a huge, huge area they are occupying. That is frontopontine fibers. Paritopontine, which is the next one, as well as occipitopontine, both. Look, I'm using the same color for that. Paritopontine and occipitopontine, both will be seen going mainly from the retrolentiform part of the internal capsule. Paritopontine and occipitopontine. Occipitopontine makes more sense. Occipital lobe is behind. And the one, obviously, the remaining one, that is temporopontine fiber. The temporopontine fiber is from the sublentiform part, which again clearly makes sense. Temporal lobe is below. Temporopontine fiber are going from the lower part of the internal capsule. That is what? From the sublentiform part. So this is the first tract we are talking about. That is the corticopontine fiber, the 4 types, and which part of internal capsule they are present in. Secondly, we said corticonuclear tract. Now guys, corticonuclear tract, very, very important. It is seen in the genu of the internal capsule. That is corticonuclear tract. The corticonuclear tract, it's an upper motor neuron for the cranial nerves. Injury to the genu, that means the upper motor neuron of all the cranial nerve is gone simultaneously. So that is the corticonuclear tract, and that's why that part becomes very important, because injury in that region will lead to the entire head and neck paralysis, because head and neck is all about the cranial nerves. Corticospinal tract. The corticospinal tract is seen in the posterior limb, but where in the posterior limb? In the anterior 2/3 of the posterior limb. There we go. It is seen in the anterior 2/3 of the posterior limb. That is the corticospinal tract. Make sure you write that also, because they've asked this question once. That is anterior 2/3 of posterior limb. That's the location of the corticospinal tract, in the anterior 2/3 of posterior limb. And you will also appreciate the extrapyramidal tract like corticobulbar tract. Remember, where was the rubrospinal tract? Red nucleus. Rubrospinal tract was very close to the lateral corticospinal tract in the spinal cord. When we drew the section of the spinal cord, you drew the lateral corticospinal tract, and very close was the rubrospinal tract. Same here. This tract is corticospinal tract. So the extrapyramidal tract like corticorubral is also close by. Majority of the extrapyramidal tract are present in the posterior limb, in close relation to the posterior limb only. Like one of them which I'm writing here is the corticorubral. Corticorubral tract. So this is, you see all the corticopontine fibers, you saw the corticonuclear fibers, you're looking at the corticobulbar fibers, that is corticospinal tract, I'm sorry, and then you're looking at the extrapyramidal tract, all in one picture here. But the most important thing to note is about these two, corticonuclear and corticospinal. Now, guys, just imagine like this. When I say corticonuclear, obviously I'm talking about the upper motor neuron of the cranial nerves, and cranial nerve supplies the head and neck part. That means the representation of the head and neck in the internal capsule is here in the genu, whereas the fibers for the remaining body, that is for the upper limb and the lower limb, they are corticospinal tract, and they are going from the posterior limb here. So that is how the body is represented in the internal capsule. You will have head and neck fibers which are present here. If let's say this is head and neck fibers, then we have representation for the upper limb, then we have the representation of trunk, and then we have representation for the lower limb of the internal capsule. That's how the body is represented in the internal capsule. And this is very important to know, because if the injury is to the genu of internal capsule, obviously there is a paralysis of head and neck muscles. If there is a injury in the anterior part of posterior limb, not the entire posterior limb, in the anterior part of posterior limb, then the upper limb muscles will be involved. And if there is an injury or the lesion in the posterior part of the posterior limb, then there will be involvement of lower limb muscles. So you have to remember the arrangement, this somatotropic arrangement of the body, not only in the cerebrum. We talked about the homunculus. If I may remind you that, where was the lower limb represented in the homunculus? Lower limb was on the medial surface. The same fibers which are for the lower limb coming from the medial surface of the motor cortex will be seen in the posterior part of the posterior limb of internal capsule, and then they will go into the brainstem and spinal cord. So if there is an injury on the medial surface of cerebrum, lower limb paralysis, contralateral side. If there is an injury in the posterior limb of the posterior limb, there is a contralateral, again lower limb paralysis. So you should know that where the fibers originate from, where the fibers are located in the internal capsule, and then how they will reach the spinal cord to exactly understand that what lesion will lead to what effects. So this is about the internal capsule, the fibers of the internal capsule, and especially the two important that you should remember, that is corticonuclear and corticospinal tract. In the next section, we will talk about the blood supply of the internal capsule also.